Somewhere under a Colorado highway, water had been finding its way into the ground for 6 years before anyone knew there was a problem. Not a leak anyone could see. Not a crack in the road surface. Just water moving through soil, doing something slow and invisible directly beneath thousands of cars a day, until December 2019, when a section of that highway didn't crack, didn't sink gradually, didn't give drivers any warning at all. Came apart. Every driver who crossed it the night before had no way of knowing the ground underneath them had already stopped being reliable. Here's the part that should bother you. When investigators finally explained what happened, the story wasn't about a flood, or a storm, or bad luck. It was about a drainage system that was never built correctly in the first place, installed by a private company that designed its own solution, signed off on its own work, and got paid for a highway wall that was already failing before the first car ever drove over it. Nobody caught it for 6 years. Not the engineers who built it. Not the state agency that approved it. Not the drivers who used it every single day. This is the story of how a shortcut buried in the ground can sit there for years, get driven over millions of times, and then choose one morning to stop holding. US 36, also called the Boulder Turnpike, is one of the busiest corridors in Colorado. A direct line connecting Denver to Boulder, carrying tens of thousands of commuters every single day. Not a forgotten backroad. One of the most heavily used pieces of infrastructure in the state, which is exactly what makes what happened near Church Ranch Boulevard so unsettling. In December 2019, a massive section of the embankment carrying the highway over a set of railroad tracks collapsed. Not a pothole. Not a crack that spread over weeks. A retaining wall that had been holding tons of soil and roadway in place simply lost its ability to do that job, and the ground it was supporting gave way. The road had to close. Traffic that normally moved freely between two of Colorado's biggest cities was forced onto detours for months, while engineers worked out not just how to repair the damage, but what had actually caused it. That second question turned out to be far harder to answer than anyone expected. It would take until 2021, almost 2 full years later, for a real answer to surface. The Colorado Department of Transportation commissioned an independent engineering firm, CTL Thompson, to investigate. What came back was a 34-page report, backed by more than 280 pages of appendices, all assembled to answer one question. Why did a wall built to last decades fail in under 6? The drainage system built into the retaining wall had never been properly designed or installed. Its job was to move water away from behind and beneath the wall. When it couldn't, that water went down instead into the clay soil underneath and stayed there. Here's the strange part. Clay doesn't fail the way most people picture ground failing. It doesn't crack, doesn't visibly shift, doesn't show a warning sign at the surface. It just quietly loses shear strength, its ability to resist sliding under load the wetter it gets. A wall built to sit on stable clay was, for years, sitting on clay being slowly turned into something the design never accounted for. Investigators had a name for what happened once that weakening reached its limit: global stability failure. Not a crack, not a leak, the entire mass of soil and wall moving together because the ground beneath it could no longer hold the shape it was built to hold. The report reached back even further than most coverage at the time realized. It pointed to a specific event 6 years before the wall failed that may have set the entire process in motion. In September 2013, the Front Range of Colorado was hit by catastrophic flooding, the kind of rainfall researchers would later describe as producing roughly 1,000 years' worth of erosion in a matter of days. That flooding hit directly during construction of the retaining wall. Rain fell straight onto an active site on ground that wasn't finished, on a drainage system that wasn't yet doing its job, if it had ever been built to do that job correctly at all. DOT's own chief engineer wouldn't hang the entire blame on that one flood. He raised another possibility, that groundwater near the site could have been slowly pulled into the clay over years, achieving the same effect independent of any single storm. 2 separate paths, a historic flood and years of ordinary groundwater movement, possibly both working toward the same outcome from different directions. Either way, the wall was compromised from early in its life. It just took 6 years of traffic and time for that to become impossible to ignore. This is the part that should unsettle anyone who assumes the road under them has been checked by people who know what they're doing. The wall wasn't built through DOT's traditional process, where the state designs a project and hires a contractor to build exactly what's specified. It went through a design-build contract, a model where a private company handles both the design and the construction, submits its own plans, and is trusted to deliver a finished product that meets standard. Design-build exists because it saves money and time. Firms compete for the work partly by proposing cost-efficient designs. That can be a legitimate advantage. It can also be exactly the pressure that leads a company to cut a corner nobody's positioned to catch, because the same company designing the solution is also the one building it, with limited independent verification of whether their innovation quietly took on more risk than it should have. DOT's chief engineer said as much once the report landed. The agency needed a more critical eye on design-build documents going forward to make sure a contractor's cost-saving idea wasn't secretly a structural gamble the public would end up paying for. That's the shortcut. Not visible. Not something anyone could catch on a walkthrough. A decision buried in drainage specifications, made by a company motivated to deliver under budget, reviewed by an agency that trusted the process more than it verified the outcome. CDOT spent $17.6 million repairing the highway, months of detours, months of a major commuter corridor running at a fraction of capacity. In August 2021, almost 2 years after the collapse, CDOT reached a $14 million settlement with the contractors responsible for the original design and build. Not a decade-long court fight. Not a case where blame stayed murky. A settlement, the closest thing this story has to an admission that once the evidence was laid out across 34 pages and 280 appendices, the people who built the wall knew exactly where the failure traced back to. CDOT has monitored the rest of the wall ever since. It hasn't moved a millimeter since the repair. Officials call it a one-off. Maybe it is, for this particular wall. But the pattern underneath it isn't unique to Colorado. Drainage systems sit buried and unverified beneath retaining walls anywhere roads climb, cross railway lines, or hold back sloped ground. Design-build contracts run on infrastructure projects across the country on the same trust-the-process model that let this one slip through for 6 years. Most of them are fine. But somewhere, on some stretch of road being driven right now, there might be a version of the same story already in progress. A system quietly failing to do its one job, with years still left to run before anyone finds out. The wall on US 36 didn't fail in December 2019. December 2019 was just the day the water finally won an argument it had been having with the ground since 2013.